noon tomorrow. And he corrected himself, and I draw your attention to that paraprax, to that slip of the tongue, and for an instant, as if by a flash of lightning, I think you can look into the American mind and into the American heart. Look at that corner of the canvas. Give up rational and non-rational or irrational explanations for a moment of this event. President and Mrs. Kennedy expected to arrive at noon. What is it? That crowd in that arena, the high school band and chorus, a whole generation born after the execution in Dallas, and yet an absolute link, the unburied revenant, the unburied ghost, the assassination in Dallas itself, a symbol for something much larger, much deeper, as old as the Cold War, as old as the hills, but in its modern lineaments, as old as the Cold War. It's the virtue of tonight's speakers that you have men, and indeed the whole generation now, the first and second generation of researchers in American history, have constantly broadened the context, deepened it. That was an authentic moment in Oklahoma City. Everyone understood exactly that slip of the tongue. Perfect, complete congruence, total understanding. Because you know, entire nations can have nervous breakdowns, not just Germany, not just Chile. But when that event in Dallas erupted, when a tendency, when a libido of power bled through in Dallas, the denial, the massive denial by all the major institutions and establishment of this country created a kind of a breakdown. And now Mr. McVeigh and Mr. Oswald are collated, Mr. Clinton and Mr. Kennedy. There is a kind of a nightmarish or dream-like syntax or logic in Oklahoma City. Now there's an attempt to tie it down rationally and in an extremely banal way, but the attempt is there, and I want to talk about that now for a moment. That typical would be America, the enemy in the Los Angeles Times of June 18th. Do the bombers of the 60s and the 90s share more than their hatred for the U.S. government inside the zealous worlds of political violence, left and right? Now the Black Panthers are being set up as an analog to the militias. A metaphysical universe is coming out of Oklahoma City. You can watch it in statu nascendi as the propaganda and the disinformation begins to develop before your eyes. The Black Panthers on the left, the Michigan militia and such ilk on the right. That's another kind of split, but this one, not like the slip of the tongue by Bernard Shaw or Reverend Graham, authentic slips of the tongue, authentic confessions of what's on the mind of the nation. No, this is manufactured by the same media that brought about this psychosis and this crisis of our history in the first place. So that what Leonard Bernstein was as a symbol to the left and the Black Panther Party in his fundraising event in his fashionable New York apartment. And this was used not by the right, I might add, but by what would have been called the liberal left to deliver the death blow to the Black liberation movement in the early 1970s. New York Magazine, the New Yorker, the New York Times, and so forth. The fatal blow came from the left side of the spectrum. Slightly left, I use these terms very provisionally, to the Black liberation movement. And as the Black liberation movement goes, so goes America, because that's the fate of this country. The color line is the fate of this country. It's not somewhere far off. It's not in Iran, it's not in the old Soviet Union, it's not in the Baltic, in the Middle Europe. It's everywhere, but it is first and foremost within this country. So Oliver Stone in the modern era is brought forward to fill the role of Leonard Bernstein in the past generation. And indeed, the entire research movement that sprang to life after the Warren Commission report is now being given as the intellectual authors of the fantasies of the militia. And one might do well to look at these fantasies, because some of these fantasies of the militia are very different from what the fantasies of the Ku Klux Klan and the fantasies of the old right, nativist and vigilante movements were. And indeed, one might argue that they are not fantasies. And yes, there is a similarity in the attitude of the right and the left towards the government. The government, said Tolstoy, who ruins the great masses of people, the organized violence of the state. The state, said Freud, who monopolizes violence and therefore forbids it to its citizens. The modern nation state, which has given us Auschwitz and Hiroshima, World War I and World War II, and the spoliation of the planet, and the wreckage of the gift outright of this planet. There is no, it beggars all other crimes. But the deduction that springs from that, that's where the question lies. And who is this new generation of militia who are not Klansmen, neo-Nazis, and others, but who can and some have come under the influence of such people, just as in Germany, returning veterans and out-of-work proletariat and lumpen proletariat were fed a diet of patriotism and nationalism and anti-capitalism and anti-Semitism, which was simply a variation on anti-capitalism, until little by little they became marginal and were destroyed and no longer needed. I think it's a great mistake to see these militias as simply a new edition or a new generation of the old vigilante movement in this country, because that old vigilante movement, even at its worst in Reconstruction, was, as you remember, the open tool of agrarian barons in the South. I mean, race was fed to the ordinary farmer and worker, an inflammatory mixture of race and class. But there were those who sat very coolly, as there are now. This political assassination of President Clinton, which began on the night before the election, when operatives of the Bush campaign were discovered in the State Department, going through his